Now let's have a chat about Assessment 2, which is coming up. It's the annotated bibliography. Now be mindful that the due date has been pushed back to the 28th of September. Now it's called the essay plan, but it boils down to an annotated bibliography of 5 different sources. You choose one of the 4 set essay questions and base your annotated bibliography on that. You need to find some of your own sources, and you're going to be assessed on your understanding of the key themes and concepts that come through these selected readings, and how you are able to explain the relevance of each article to your selected question. So you might be able to say, well, this article is quite relevant, it has a lot of detail. Or you might say this article is only partly relevant, but it does address one key concept in some good detail, or something like that. So it's an annotated bibliographic entry for 5 references. A maximum of 2 of those references can be taken from the weekly reading list. The rest you need to find using your own research. Now, for each reference, you're going to want to have the full Harvard-style reference at the top. You're going to basically have a summary in words, right, of the key points of the article, and you're going to discuss the relevance of this reference to the selected question. Now remember, it's 500 words in total. You don't need to count the full Harvard reference or headings or anything like that. But this means that you need to write in a clear and concise way. Be quite selective in what information you include in each entry. Part of the skill in research and processing this information and the concepts and everything that you're learning is being selective, knowing what to focus on and what to let go of, basically. Now, let's come back to structure, because a lot of students seem to be a bit concerned about this. Start off with the full Harvard reference. You don't include that in your word count. You might want to quickly note who wrote the article and what's the purpose of the article, but don't waste too much word count on fluffing that section out. You might want to include that just briefly. Now, the real sort of core of this exercise is, what are the key arguments? You need to give an overall summary, your summary of the key arguments of the article. You need to indicate some kind of evaluation of the article. Here are some things you might want to think about, and as long as you're careful with word count, you might want to focus on, like, well, here are some strong points about the article, here are some weaknesses. Now, what are some of the things you might want to discuss in terms of strengths and weaknesses? You might comment on whether the article uses a broad range of evidence or how it produces its data or evidence. You might want to talk about if the article is old or recent. Maybe it draws on some well-established theoretical resources, or maybe it's a good empirical study. And that will help you make that decision on how closely related it is to the essay topic. And building on your sort of summary and evaluation, you're going to say, well, here is how it relates back to the chosen essay topic. Here's how it supports the arguments I'm trying to make. So, how to pass? You only have 500 words for all 5 entries. So the key to this assessment, I should say, is summarizing, paraphrasing, and expressing ideas in your own words. So this means you might want to think about reading the source, taking notes, thinking about it, and something that I find can be helpful is imagine explaining these key points to a friend, obviously a friend not doing the course. That will help you process in your mind the most important bits, and help you, come up with a sort of a condensed or concise summary. Why bother with this activity? I mean, it's not just to make your life more difficult or to get you marks. It's because this kind of practice, it's not just research practice, right? It's about helping you process complex information sources, internalizing the key points within your own mental frameworks, right? And developing your own ability uh, to process these, retain the information, and express these complex ideas to other people. If you can't express the idea clearly, have you really, interpreted it very well? Okay? And that's what my next point on the slide is about. Why do we want to share ideas with others? It's less to do with sharing knowledge, although that's fantastic, that's important. But it's to do with the fact that we develop a deeper understanding of something when we are able to explain it to other people. So, in my experience, some students try to skip this internalization process and go from finding a source and locating a quote or idea to then just repeating it in the middle of an essay without much nuance or without really demonstrating that they've understood and incorporated the ideas into their own mental apparatus. Believe me, it shows in the written submissions. So try to follow this advice so that you gradually get to the stage in your studies where you are using the references rather than the references using you. Now, just quickly, a look ahead to the essay topics for the final essay because you'll need to pick one of these to do your annotated bibliography. Now, the first one is about recent crime prevention policy and initiatives can be seen as highly politicized, discuss the link between law and order politics, the fear of crime, and crime prevention strategy using local examples. The second topic is citing examples, provide a critical analysis of preventive policing strategies, e.g., hotspot, zero tolerance, problem oriented policing, etc., and discuss their impact on the community, and in your answer discuss why these strategies are popular and if there are any side effects on police-community relations. The third topic is the crime prevention industry is growing at a rapid pace in Australia and around the world. Critically discuss this trend and outline some of the key dangers that may emerge from the commercialization of crime control. And the fourth topic, discuss the importance of evaluation to crime prevention strategy. Why is it so important in producing effective crime policy and prevention strategies? Okay, have a read through those. If you haven't already, pick a topic to inform your literature search and thus your annotated bibliography. Now let's just do a quick recap of what was discussed last week. When it comes to crime prevention and crime control as industry or product, different incentive structures are at play that are not necessarily aligned with the long-term aims of crime prevention or concerns about justice. Crime prevention and crime control can have indirect flow-on economic consequences. Some of these things include the renewal of regional and rural economies, employing or occupying a certain portion of a society's available labour force, and also providing cheap, or some would argue slave, labour for the state and private commercial interests. There's a lot of room for misconduct in the absence of any clear and consistent regulatory frameworks. Until the mid 1980s in Australia, there was no industry specific regulation. From that point on, there have been a series or a few waves of reactionary and piecemeal regulatory fixes that have mostly been in response to publicised scandals. And there remains a need for proactive and responsive regulation instead. So, not about band aid fixes, but thinking long term and big picture. This week, we are going to be talking about alternative modes of crime prevention, and specifically the idea of restorative justice and reintegrative shaming. This week's lecture is going to be drawing on the week's readings, as well as a chapter from Crime and Criminology called Republican Theory and Restorative Justice. We're going to talk about Republican theory first because that is the philosophical foundation for this idea of restorative justice and reintegrative shaming, and in turn that will have an effect on how crime and the prevention of crime is conceptualized and operationalized. Now, um, one of the sort of key aspects of Republican approaches to thinking about crime is that it views a need for restorative rather than punitive justice. So, restoration is about an interaction between offenders and victims. The idea is that human interaction will produce a sense of regret and remorse in the offender and an apology for the harm that they've caused. Now, Republican theory is a comprehensive view about crime and society, and it offers what we call a normative framework, which is a framework that argues how society should function, and it has certain values that underpin the ideal criminal justice system. So, um, it's a critique of authoritarian populism in the sense that it argues you can use reason and justice to inform institutional practices rather than drawing on base emotions of fear and hatred. Republican, the idea of reintegrative shaming is sort of at the center of the practice of restorative justice, which is within this Republican framework. So it emerged within a particular, it's a response to a neoliberal economic and political and social context, and it highlights, there's a shift towards focusing on the impacts of offending on the victims of crime. Now, moving on from that sort of brief overview, we need to discuss a few key concepts. Republican theory mixes a focus on the contemporary conditions of crime with the historical philosophical tradition of Republican liberalism. So this relates to a long sort of historical strand of ideas around notions of liberty. This strand can be traced through Roman times, through to the English Civil War, to the American Revolution, and so on. Freedom is perceived as a social status, that someone who enjoys, someone who isn't a slave, right? And so what that means is freedom is the status of a person who is so protected by the law and the culture of their community that they don't depend on the grace of another person for the enjoyment of independent choice. They don't rely on a master or an owner to grant them independent choices. So liberty, in the Republican sense, is conceptualized as not being interfered with by others. Now, this notion of liberty was distorted in the 19th century with a different sense of liberalism. This idea of liberalism in the 19th century, what we now sort of refer to as classical liberalism, focused more on avoiding interference by the state and the law altogether, and to exclude the enjoyment of being protected against possible interference. This is what we might call right-wing libertarian perspectives on liberty. So this perspective promotes the notion of the free market and seeks to remove government constraints, especially when it comes to trade and the labor market. The enjoyment of non-interference in our lives is therefore at the mercy of those who choose to interfere. Classical liberalism or libertarian views of liberty don't value in the same way that Republican liberty values the status of being protected by the law and culture of a community from the interference of an offender. So let's talk about this Republican version of liberty a little bit more. It involves a concept of personal liberty that is constituted by protection of liberty by the law. Non-interference in your liberty is not just a matter of luck, but it should be something extended to all citizens by the law and the institutions of law. Now, if this non-interference is to be resilient or secure in nature, that is, the person who enjoys non-interference, they need to be protected from the predations of a potential interferer. So the law should come in, or other protective social institutions come in and block interference from others and provide compensation where necessary in order to restore someone to their former status as someone with liberty. So the law and related institutions are seen to play a central role in maintaining Republican liberty. So this challenges some of the key philosophical ideas around retributivism. Retribution is talking about, treatment, rehabilitation, and prevention measures have failed in the past, so we need to push for harsher punishments for offenders that are proportionate to the seriousness of the offense, and how guilty the offender is. Republican theory takes a more holistic view and uses the concept of personal dominion as central to understanding the problem of crime and how the criminal justice system should respond. Now, personal dominion basically is the idea that individuals should be free from unwanted interference in their liberty, right? And they should be able to fulfill their potential within a society that respects that idea of liberty. Crime is therefore the denial of personal dominion. Now, I'm not sure how clear this table is in the slideshow video, but have a look on your slides, because there's just a brief chart that I've taken out of that book chapter with a summary of some of the key focus points of Republican theory as it relates to criminal justice. Let's talk about the denial of dominion in a little bit more detail. Braithwaite, who's a big scholar in Republican theory and restorative justice, says there are three sort of consequences of the denial of dominion. You have this negative challenge to the dominion status of the victim. So, a threat or disregard for someone's dominion is an attack on the status of that individual. For example, if someone commits a crime against an individual, the criminal act asserts the vulnerability of the victim to the will of the criminal. It nullifies the status of the victim as someone who is protected by society. The second point is that the criminal act, it doesn't just disregard dominion, but it undermines, diminishes, or possibly destroys that dominion, that personal liberty. For example, kidnapping or murdering someone is more or less the ultimate destruction of that person's dominion. Even stealing property diminishes dominion because it undermines the way that someone might have exercised their dominion or their liberty had that property not been stolen. So we're talking about inhibiting the capacity of a person to exercise agency. And the third consequence is that every criminal act also represents a communal evil. It does wrong to the community as a whole because it endangers the community's notion of its own resilient status. It's a threat to that status. So every act of crime is a challenge to the dominion of people in society more generally, because each one is like chipping away at a mountain and contributing a sense of doubt as to their own protected status. Now, this is a really busy slide. I'm just going to make a few key points, contrasting Republican approaches with other criminal justice approaches. Now, if every act of crime is damage to dominion, the state, through the criminal justice system, has a responsibility to promote or re-promote dominion. And it does this by rectifying or remedying the damage caused by crime. Now, Republican perspectives, as mentioned earlier, argue against retributive theory and its emphasis on harsher sentencing. Why is this a problem for Republican thinking? Because retribution does not take into account its impacts on broader society or the impacts of crime on broader society. So, retributivist theory is insufficient because a theory cannot simply tinker with one part of the system here or there. In the case of retribution, it's just talking about punishment. A good theory of crime and how we respond to crime needs to look at the system and society as a whole. Republican theorists are also critical of goal-oriented approaches like utilitarianism, which suggests that we should promote the greatest good for the greatest number, because it is possible that injustices can lead to good for a greater number of people. So, within the Republican theory framework, there's this assumption of an equilibrium model of criminal justice. Equilibrium meaning balance, restoring a balance. So the restoration of the dominion status of the victim by reintegrating the victim back into society so that they can once again exercise personal dominion. Now, the recognition of the dominion of the victim by the offender requires a mix of measures, both symbolic and material. So, on the Republican point of view, the causes of crime lie in a mix of social and psychological factors, and part of the problem is this lack of self-sanctioning conscience. What this means is an individual potential or actual offender hasn't learned to interpret and accept the social norms and values of their society. Now, one of the results of a punitive and stigmatizing system is that it pushes people into associating with other similarly ostracized individuals. For example, we're talking about criminal subcultures, right? So, a group of people who collectively haven't developed this self-sanctioning conscience. They haven't developed this ability to interpret and accept societal norms. So this brings us to interdependency and social opportunity. The lack of adequate and appropriate social connections is expressed in this idea of communitarianism, which is more or less talking about how at the societal level we all share this interdependency, this reliance on one another and our social institutions, and this interdependence is comprised of relationships of loyalty and trust and concern. Interdependency is reflected in a person's relationship to school, to work, their marriage, their stable residence. It's how invested they are in the society and the community around them and the institutions that are made by that society and that community and that make up that society and that community. So this brings us to this idea of social opportunity, because it affects the opportunities that an individual has. It affects their interdependencies on other people and other institutions, and as a result, it impacts their moral development. So Republican theories of criminal justice are focused on dealing with the victim so that they can once again exercise public dominion, that personal liberty, and the community can be reassured that yes, our dominion is protected. So, while the focus is on maximizing personal dominion for the victim, there is also the assumption that the offender needs to be reintegrated in society so that their own dominion can be reinstated. It's all part of the same process. So, Republican theory is looking for a minimalist response from the state upon the offender. So, in terms of a crime prevention perspective, Republican approaches are going to say, well, we need to take steps to promote the norms that we value, because this becomes the basis for the formation of a self-sanctioning conscience in people. So we need to foster greater communitarianism, greater social interdependence by enhancing the educational work and social opportunities available to people. So the criminal justice system should incorporate a broad range of informal and formal institutional arrangements. This can include restorative justice conferencing when it comes to the offender and their victims. And the system needs to be oriented towards the least intrusive kind of punishment possible. The more intrusive the punishment, the less likely the possibility of reintegration into society and of restoring dominion, of restoring justice. Now, this brings us to restorative justice. Some scholars and practitioners of restorative justice view it as an alternative or even a critique of retributive criminal justice. Now, as we mentioned earlier, retributive criminal justice is basically criticized because of its excessive focus on establishing guilt and apportioning blame. This has stigmatizing effects. Guilt and criminal punishment stigmatizes the people subjected to that. And also, importantly, there's a failure to meet the needs of the victims of crime. There seems to be this disproportionate emphasis on punishing offenders and little consideration for the sort of lived experience and the impact on the victims of crime. So, foundational restorative justice scholars, such as Braithwaite, as mentioned earlier, they see restorative justice as a way of reducing offending with an orientation toward the final goal of crime reduction. Restoring offenders is framed in terms of reduced offending rather than rehabilitation. So we need to make that distinction. Rehabilitation of offenders is not the aim of restorative justice. It's actually reduced offending. So when the criminal justice system is seen as trying to change people, this fosters a resistance to change. Rehabilitative programs with professionals who come in and they intervene and they change things around are by nature stigmatizing or stigmatic. And you may remember this from previous weeks as well, where we've discussed social prevention and things like that. Now, as a result of this, these programs are more likely to contribute to rather than inhibit crime. The main problem for some authors in this regard is that reducing recidivism might be an unrealistic goal for restorative justice. Another issue with reducing recidivism is that framing crime prevention basically as a main goal of restorative justice, it's problematic not just because it is so much as it's unrealistic. It's not really unrealistic, but because it diminishes the other goals of restorative justice, particularly the victim-centered goals. So there should be a focus on victim needs being central to restorative justice. Now, for much of the research literature and practice around this, this disproportionate focus on offender outcomes is managed by rejecting rehabilitation as an aim, and rather welcoming the crime reduction aspect as a side effect of restorative justice. Now, for most theorists and practitioners, rehabilitation and preventing reoffending, they can be legitimate goals of restorative justice, but they need to be situated with reference to the needs of other stakeholders in the process. In this way, Rehabilitation of offenders is only a legitimate goal of restorative justice if it's compatible with the goal of justice for victims. Now, alternatively, reducing reoffending and rehabilitation might not necessarily detract from the benefit or the justice to victims, but victims might actually welcome or desire it themselves to see the offenders make a change. Now, historically, there's been a tendency towards vague or ambiguous aims in restorative justice, such as the restoration of victims, offenders, and communities. It's a worthy goal, but it's difficult to operationalize in practice. And another issue is that, in practice, restorative justice programs have often been associated with multiple aims and objectives that are not necessarily valued or shared by all the stakeholders in the process. Now, thinking about restorative justice and desistance. Now, desistance, which is when offenders stop offending, is also difficult to precisely define and operationalize. But it's increasingly accepted that desistance is a process of gradually decreasing involvement in crime rather than a sudden change in behavior. Some of the factors that promote desistance towards the end of the age crime curve, which is around the early 20s, and those of you who've done juvenile crime and justice will be more familiar with the age crime curve. And these are not always the same factors that protect against criminal involvement in adolescence. Employment and accommodation normally feature strongly in the factors that contribute towards desistance. There are also agentic elements, elements where people it's the decision to try to desist, people's self-perceptions of the possibility of a non-offending life, and people considering a possible new self and social identity. These agentic elements are becoming seen as critical, and by agentic we mean someone's power to act in the world of their own free will. So let's think about desistance processes. We've got this increasing attention to the agentic elements, and as a result, that means we need to pay increasing attention to the processes in restorative justice interventions. There may be possible cognitive and emotional processes involved in desistance that are also at play in restorative justice interventions. So there's no clear evidence yet regarding the causal order of decisions to desist, changes in identity, and behaviors of desistance. Because methodologically, most of the studies have used retrospective reports from people who have desisted. But whatever the order of these events, the opportunities provided by restorative justice for offenders to think about and discuss with others about their possible future lives, or their future self, could be rare but important safe spaces for offenders who want to desist, that allow them to think about what they're going to do in the next few months of their lives and how to actually live these next few months without offending. Now, one of the key prerequisites of a restorative justice encounter, such as conferencing, is that the offender must consent to the process, and the offender must admit to the offense early on in the process. So, in principle, it's rare for offenders in restorative justice encounters who have been coerced there or who deny responsibility for their actions. Voluntary conferencing therefore requires offenders who understand they've committed a criminal act and caused harm. So, from that point, among offender participants, a significant portion should already be thinking about desistance and be motivated by wanting to desist. So, the motivational posture of offenders entering restorative justice processes are more likely to be characterized by genuine commitment to the process compared to offenders who've been coerced into new treatment programs based on their risk profiles. So the restorative justice encounter might also provide some offenders a more appropriate forum to express or release feelings of shame, guilt, and remorse. Now, it's important to understand that restorative justice, as an element of a Republican theory of crime and liberty, is underpinned by the theory of reintegrative shaming. And it's important to understand that this is a different kind of shaming to stigmatizing or stigmatic shaming. Reintegrative shaming is disapproval that is respectful of the person. It ends with forgiveness. It doesn't label someone as evil. And it doesn't allow that condemnation and negative image to become their master status, right? Reintegrative shaming should result in less offending. Stigmatizing shaming is disrespectful of the offender. It doesn't end with any forgiveness or resolution. It labels the person as evil, and it allows that label, that status, to stick. And it's argued that this results in greater levels of offending. Now, these sort of hypotheses have actually been examined in empirical studies in various contexts. One study examined the theory as part of a broader investigation into compliance by nursing homes with a set of regulatory standards. So reintegrative shaming isn't limited to criminal justice interventions, but is a way of behavioral change more generally. Now, in this nursing home investigation, it was found that the nursing home inspectors who were disapproving but had a reintegrative attitude obtained the greatest compliance compared to inspectors who were permissive, that is, they didn't openly disapprove of what was being done wrong, and in turn, that was greater compliance than inspectors who were disapproving but didn't show any reintegrative sort of attitude. Another area where reintegrative shaming theory has been applied is in understanding the effect of parental discipline style on bullying behavior in school children. So, an Australian study investigated this relationship between a parent's self-reported discipline style and children's self-reported bullying behavior. Parents with a stigmatizing parental style were more likely to have children who reported self-initiated bullying against other children. Compared to this, non-stigmatizing parental styles were associated with significantly lower levels of this more serious type of bullying. So Braithwaite has argued for two main mechanisms when it comes to reintegrative shaming. The first mechanism is that reintegrative shaming is an effective deterrent, particularly when it comes from those people who are close to the individual, to the offender, because it poses a threat to valued relationships. The second mechanism, which is argued to be more important, is that reintegrative shaming communicates that certain behaviors are wrong, and as a result helps to build internalized controls. Now, although the specific emotion is not clearly identified, both of these mechanisms, the fear of disapproval from valued relationships and the development of internalized controls or bad conscience, allude to shame-related emotions. The implication, which is yet to be empirically tested, is that the effect of disapproval on behavior is mediated by emotions caused by disapproval. Now, reintegrative shaming theory has heavily influenced the development of restorative justice conferencing. Conferencing originated in early 1990s Wagga Wagga in New South Wales, Australia, and the model spread to other parts of Australia as well as in America and the UK. Braithwaite describes reintegrative shaming as disapproval dispensed within an ongoing relationship with the offender based on respect, shaming which focuses on the evil of the deed rather than on the offender. Reintegrative shaming works as a way to induce guilt and remorse from the offender and serves as a precondition for forgiveness, acceptance, and reconciliation with the law-abiding community. So it's about conscience building and reaffirming the morality of the offender. This newly formed or reformed morality or conscience helps to function to inhibit future offending. For the offender, significant others or people from their community of care play an important role in reintegrative shaming. The disapproval of the offense means more coming from these people, these valued relationships, than from a magistrate or a judge, because the offender has no personal investment or connection to these social figures. Community judgment is not about pain or punishment, but rather it's about education and reintegration. It's about persuading offenders to share the community's assessment of their behavior and act accordingly. Importantly, victim testimony will help the offender understand the harm that they've done and the damage that they've caused. Some researchers, though, question whether reintegrative shaming is a necessary ingredient of successful restorative justice conferencing with regard to reduced offending. Maxwell and Morris, for example, conducted a study of conference participants in New Zealand. Some of the factors that were specific to conferencing that were also relevant to reduced reconvictions included feeling remorse, not being made to feel a bad person, and meeting and apologizing to victims. The conference-specific factors that predicted reoffending were that the young person and the parents felt shame, stigmatic shame that is, and there was a lack of remorse. In a South Australian study, remorse was also one of two significant conference variables associated with reduced offending, the other variable being that the conferencing ended on a positive note. Maxwell and Morris, therefore, sort of question whether shaming or disapproval in itself is a necessary mechanism to invoke remorse. They suggest that there's another possibility that actually empathy and understanding the impact on victims is a trigger for this remorse. Recent research on reintegrative shaming theory suggests that hearing the victim's story might trigger emotions of empathy and compassion in the offender, thus leading to a feeling of remorse, shame, and guilt. But this is only when the offender themselves is treated with some empathy. So there's a theoretical time frame for changes in offender attitudes. This starts with the reintegrative shaming in the conference, a feeling of remorse, a change in the offender, and or hearing the victim in the conference, empathy and compassion, remorse, change in offending. Now let's do a quick summary of some of the key points that we've covered. The restorative justice approach to crime prevention involves a wholesale rethink of the nature of crime and criminal justice. Restoration is grounded in the principles of Republican theories of liberty and dominion, crime is a violation of personal dominion of the victim, and it's also a harm done to the whole community. Responding to crime and preventing recidivism requires reintegrating the offender back into the community. Reintegration involves reintegrative, non-stigmatizing shaming and recognition of harm done to victims. Reintegrative shaming can help offenders take responsibility for their actions and learn to share the same norms and values of the community when it comes to offending. Now, some researchers suggest that empathy, that is, treating the offender with empathy, and the offender feeling empathy for their victim, is a significant factor in the development of offender remorse and desire to change, and therefore crime prevention. Now, here are some questions that you may want to consider this week when it comes to the topic. 1. What role should concepts of justice play in our thinking about crime prevention more generally? We haven't really taken justice into consideration so far in the course. 2. How might the ideas and practices of restoration and reintegration contribute to crime prevention efforts? And 3. How does this Republican theory approach to crime prevention impact our assumptions about crime? And remember, our assumptions about crime are going to underpin our assumptions about crime prevention and what we want to focus on and how we frame crime prevention. Now, next week, we're looking at evaluating crime prevention. Next week's reading is Sutton, Cherney, and White. That may not be available online in digital format. You may have to try and track down the book from the library. I will make an alternative reading available on Views as well for student equity reasons. So just keep an eye out for that. Now, the guiding questions. 1. Why would we bother with evaluation? How does evaluation help in our crime prevention efforts? 2. What are some key challenges in evaluating crime prevention? And 3. What are some outcomes or factors we would want to look at when evaluating crime prevention interventions? Have a think about these questions while preparing for next week, going through the readings and so on. And this will hopefully help guide you to get the most out of it. And finally, I've got a few key references for this week that you might find useful. There's the Crime and Criminology book chapter that I mentioned earlier. There's the 2 assigned readings. Those were the sources that influenced most of this lecture. But you may also want to have a look at some of Braithwaite's material. I've listed a few references down there as well because they are, as I said, a big deal when it comes to restorative justice ideas. So you may want to engage more closely with that material. Okay, all the best this week, and I will see you next week.